Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Last year I had more free time than usual, because of the lockdown which started in March, the first of many. I used the time provided by this lockdown to make these videos. Hyperlinks will be in the description, and I also used some of this time to play more computer games, including StarCraft 2, Wings of Liberty, for the first time. I understand Korean culture a lot better now. During the lockdown, a friend recommended that I play Mass Effect Andromeda to kill some time. Although I had some time to kill, I was hesitant, for obvious reasons, but he explained there was a website where it was selling as cheap as dirt, so I went ahead and bought the game on said website. The best thing about this purchase was that BioWare didn't get any of my money.
Alright, what happened?
To who?
To whom? And your father? Sorry, my face is tired from dealing with everything.
Yes, totally worth £60 BioWare. For this video, I am not interested in the quality of the animations or the plot integrity of the story. What I am interested in discussing is the feeling, the experience the game gives the player. To be specific, I wish to discuss how Mass Effect Andromeda created a strange game experience by splitting off and dividing itself from the other three titles. In short, I want to explain why Mass Effect Andromeda feels off. Because, while playing Mass Effect Andromeda, I rarely had thoughts along the lines of, this is a bad game. Oftentimes, my thoughts were, this game feels off. Before I get into the meat of this essay, some groundwork must be laid. Despite appearances, Mass Effect Andromeda is not Mass Effect 4, and it is not a sequel. It takes place some 634 years after Mass Effect 3, but it is not a sequel. Or put another way, it is in no way a continuation of the Mass Effect trilogy. Mass Effect Andromeda is more rightly categorized as a spin-off. Or, considering its failure to impress, a spin-oof. A fully funded and large spin-off, which was meant to function as a soft reboot. Here's the reason it is a spin-off. Mass Effect was, at its heart, the story of Commander Shepard and his fight against the Reapers. The story, as well, had a beginning, a middle, and an end, or ends, all of which were terrible. I can recommend Smudboy's videos on the topic. Since Mass Effect Andromeda does not continue the Reaper story, picking up from Mass Effect 3, it is not a sequel of any kind. Mass Effect Andromeda does not continue Shepard's story, and neither does it continue the chronology of the Mass Effect trilogy, because Andromeda is completely separated from the events of the last three games. Mass Effect Andromeda might as well be set in a separate universe. Concerning the original games, all three were defined by the story of Shepard and the Reapers, and this is why the next Mass Effect installment was always going to have difficulties. Mass Effect 3's endings dealt with the Reaper problem. BioWare would not have been able to make a game with the Reapers, even if they wanted. They could have made a game set during the Reaper invasion, with different characters, fighting in a relatively isolated part of the Milky Way. And while such a game would be fun, it would feel like an insignificant sideshow, because the shadow of the Mass Effect trilogy would be looming over it, and every player would know the important decisions in that grand narrative were being made by a different set of characters. Of course, BioWare could have made a prequel of some kind, but while that would be good, it probably would feel and be perceived as a step back, and not a step forward. Moreover, a prequel would necessarily be constrained in its vision, because it wouldn't be allowed to change or alter the lore in ways which would cause continuity difficulties for the main trilogy. But the real problem for BioWare was it would have been difficult to make a sequel set in the Milky Way after the ending events of Mass Effect 3. Let's ignore the issue of whether the endings were well written or not, and just assess what the endings meant for the Milky Way galaxy. All three endings, two of which have bad and good ending states, that is, there are good and bad destroy endings, and good and bad control endings, have massive consequences for the Milky Way and its species. Add to these endings other player choices, such as whether the Geth and Quarians were reconciled or not, whether the genophage was cured, etc. And you have a team of developers and writers sweating profusely. The amount of time, money, and effort to produce a new game which would respect these choices and endings would simply be enormous. The simple option would be to pick one of the endings, let's say the Good Destroy ending for instance. Some of the choices, such as the Genophage cured and the Quarians chosen over the Geth, and make them canon. This would resolve the development and writing problems, but it would anger fans. One major complaint about Mass Effect 3's endings was the players' choices didn't have much effect. Now imagine the anger if players, who carefully deliberated upon their endgame choices in Mass Effect 3, saw their final decisions ignored in Mass Effect 4. Addendum. Recently, BioWare released a trailer for the new Mass Effect game which is in development, and it appears that they are making a sequel. And judging by the Citadel and this motionless Reaper in the background, it would appear they have chosen to make a version of the Destroy ending canon. I think this is going to be a controversial choice, but it does demonstrate just how badly Mass Effect Andromeda was received, because BioWare clearly decided it wasn't worth attempting a sequel to Mass Effect Andromeda. The company had to choose their poison, and they have clearly decided this chalice of hemlock is the most palatable. So with all this said, only one choice remained for BioWare: running away from the Milky Way as fast as possible and attempting to concoct some story in another galaxy, which would entertain players while still being a Mass Effect game. Thus, the problems of Mass Effect Andromeda do spring from the endings of Mass Effect 3, but not because the endings were bad, but instead because they were galaxy-altering. Despite having no story-related reasons to exist, Mass Effect Andromeda was not doomed to be a bad game for that reason, but because of all the factors I have listed, which persuaded the developers to take the franchise to another galaxy, it was slammed in between a rock and a hard place. Half of the elements which defined the Mass Effect world were left by the Arcs when they set off for Andromeda. The mass relays, gone. The Citadel, gone. Omega, gone. The Vorcha, the Elcor, the Volus, the Batarians, the Hanar, the Drell, the Geth, the Quarians, the Prothean Ruins, the Reapers, the political organisations such as the Alliance, the Turian Hierarchy, etc., the recognisable and beloved characters, the Milky Way galaxy, and some of the weapons. All gone. An awful lot was left behind during the move. And of course, the story which began in Mass Effect 1 and ended in Mass Effect 3 was left behind as well. So the BioWare Montreal team had to create a Mass Effect spin-off, with half of the established franchise elements missing. Mass Effect Andromeda had to establish itself as an almost separate franchise in an almost separate world, while still having connections to the already established franchise and world. Truly, the Montreal team had set themselves an ambitious and daring task, a task which would require a delicate balancing of old and new elements. Unfortunately, BioWare Montreal was simply not up to the task, and, to be fair, I am not surprised, because this would have been difficult even for the best writers and developers. Mass Effect Andromeda as an experience is rather strange. It simultaneously invokes Mass Effect, while feeling nothing like a Mass Effect game. Whenever you see the Milky Way aliens, the Krogan, the Turians, the Asari, and the Solarians, you are reminded that you are playing a Mass Effect game. But everything else feels off. The combat is similar, but different enough for you to wonder whether you aren't playing some other third-person shooter. The music, while good and serviceable, has few Mass Effect vibes, and while the character interactions are fairly Mass Effect, the absence of Paragon and Renegade dialogue options is felt, and none of the characters, with the exceptions of Drac, Vetra, perhaps Callow, and maybe Cora on a good day, acts like a competent individual, who is ready for the dangers of the Helios cluster. Alright, let's slow down. Here is my main thesis. Mass Effect Andromeda is a spin-off acting as a soft reboot, but it doesn't feel like either of these two things. In fact, it feels like a spiritual successor, with Mass Effect intellectual property imported into its makeup. The reason for this? The obvious splits in continuity and design between the Mass Effect trilogy and Mass Effect Andromeda, which create a great divide between the most recent game and its predecessors. These splits break down into 5. The story split, the world split, the character split, the tone split, and the gameplay split. Additionally, something which helped create the divide, but isn't a split per se, is the homage factor. Let's go through these. I've already commented on this, but what I'll add here is that this was a necessary split. The story of Shepard and the Reapers ended in Mass Effect 3. A new story was needed from the start. Unfortunately, this split wasn't managed well. Mass Effect Andromeda's story is terrible. It's not so much that there are contrivances or plot holes, it's more that it's unengaging. And it is unengaging because it is boring all round. The villain is boring. The chase after the MacGuffins is boring. The plot events are boring. The story is just boring, and if it weren't for the thrill of shooting and cutting down hundreds of kett, the lackluster space adventure would be unbearably tedious. This has been mentioned, but I need to elaborate. As stated previously, many elements of the Mass Effect universe are missing in Andromeda. The locations, the Mass Effect relays, the political factions, some of the weaponry and species, etc. are absent in Andromeda. This is adequate to make a clear split from the previous games, because the environment is different enough for any player to notice he is not in Mass Effect's Milky Way. Nevertheless, it is not a complete split. There is still Mass Effect field technology, Mass Effect weaponry, a few Milky Way species, and the general aesthetic for things like the Tempest is very Alliance and Mass Effect. This caused some setting confusion for me. On the one hand, I felt like I wasn't playing a Mass Effect game, because of everything which was missing. But on the other hand, I knew I was playing a Mass Effect game, because some things from the previous games were present, such as the Turians, Asari, and Solarians. The absence of world elements from the Mass Effect trilogy was apparent because the Turians, Asari, and Solarians are supposed to inhabit a universe where the Volus, Elcor, and Hanar live nearby. I could see that something was missing. What's more, I felt the absence of the missing world blocks, because Mass Effect Andromeda didn't fill in those gaps with its own creations. For instance, there are no political organisations which fill the hole left by the Alliance, unless you count Exile Bands and the Angaran Rokar, which are not memorable factions. The absence of the missing species is felt because the only two new species which take their place are the Angara and the Kett. Only one of these is friendly to the player, and the other is a copy of the Collectors. If you count the Remnant, then there is a third species, but they are robots made by an alien species called the Jardan. Together, the Remnant and the Jardan function much the same as the Protheans in Mass Effect 1, so two of the new world elements are not new at all, and are just trying to invoke previous creations. The game is composed of a small amount of Mass Effect and a small amount of Andromeda. Despite the fact the game is set in Andromeda's Helios cluster, the world building is negligible. The same reskinned animals appear on all the planets, and the environments of those planets are hardly imaginative. They could easily belong in the Milky Way. The only thing which actually struck me as new and interesting was the Abyssal, or the giant remnant machine worm, in Elidan's desert. Whenever I saw it emerge from the sand, I felt that I was in another part of the Mass Effect universe, because I knew I would not have seen that in Mass Effect's Milky Way. Unfortunately, you don't learn anything about it or its history, which leads me to my next point. The entire cluster feels like it has no history, and this is a problem. Let's do a few quick comparisons. Let's compare the Angara to the Turians, and the Kett to the Reapers. What does the player learn about the Angara's history in Mass Effect Andromeda? Well, he learns they were made by the Jardan, who are responsible for the creation of the Remnant Vaults. That the Angara were happy and content until the magical energy cloud called the Scourge came along, destroying most of their historical documents. And then how the Kett arrived and really ruined their day. The player also learns that the recent history of the Angara has been defined by their 80-year-long war with the Kett, and nothing else. What does the player learn about the Turians' history in the first game? He learns that they are the most recent Council race, and they were allowed to join the Council because they helped put down the Krogan rebellions. That some of the Turian colonies tried to secede from the Turian hierarchy in the past, and this caused their unification war, and that the Turians also started the First Contact War with the humans, which incidentally caused the unification of Earth under the banner of the Alliance. What does the player learn about the Kett's history in Mass Effect Andromeda? Most of it is learned from the Angara. Basically, the kett arrived in the Helios cluster sometime after the Scourge, and after gaining the Angara's trust, they declared war on them. Later in the game, the player discovers that the kett are turning the Angara into kett via genetic engineering. This is it. The player learns nothing else about the kett's history. Alright, let's compare this with the Reaper history in Mass Effect 1. Everything the player learns about the Reapers comes from the conversation with Sovereign, and to a lesser extent, the conversation with Vigil. It is discovered that the Reapers built the mass relays, not the Protheans, which is the assumption the player would have had beforehand, that every 50,000 years, the Reapers exterminate all intelligent starfaring species in the Milky Way, in order to continue the cycle which has been ongoing for millions, if not billions of years. Their origins and their motivations are not explained, but these are left for the player to discover later in the trilogy. Hopefully, these quick comparisons show just how deep and interesting the history was in Mass Effect 1, and how shallow and uninteresting it is in Mass Effect Andromeda. The history in Mass Effect was well developed, and was a part of the world building, while the history in Mass Effect Andromeda seems to have been made up on the fly, and doesn't really play a part in building the world. Because there is so little in Andromeda, the game leans heavily on the imported elements from the prior games. The problem is, there simply aren't enough of these elements to establish a strong world-based identity for the game. So this split may not be total, but even its partial nature is felt, and it is amplified by the previously mentioned gaps not being filled in any meaningful way. Mass Effect Andromeda needed to provide a fully fleshed out world. Instead, the developers put together a wrecked skeleton and grafted some muscle onto it from the previous games. To reiterate, none of the characters, with the exceptions of Drac, Vetra, perhaps Callow, and maybe Cora on a good day, acts like a competent individual who is ready for the dangers of the Helios cluster. Allow me to expound. Characters such as Liam, Suvi, Gil, and PB act like bright-eyed university graduates on a field trip, with all expenses accounted for by their university. They are all bad, but I think Liam is the worst, and his background is actually incongruent with his personality. Liam has worked in a civilian crisis response unit, but he doesn't have the gravitas or the weight of a man who has evacuated people from disaster zones, or given emergency medical attention to someone on the brink of death. He certainly doesn't strike me as a man who would charge into battle using a jetpack so as to kill his foes with a pair of Omniblades. He strikes me as the kind of young man you might meet in the street, trying to persuade you to donate to a charity project which aims to change the world. He has a very optimistic and happy-go-lucky personality, and barely seems capable of taking things seriously. His lines throughout the game are consistently like this.
I think I really p***ed that one off. Maybe because I shot him in the face.
Considering Liam's personality, his presence as a member of the Pathfinder team makes little sense. It raises a big question. How did he get a job on the Pathfinder team? Why did Alec Ryder, a seasoned soldier, choose him? Of course, the same can be said of Suvi, Gil, and PB, because their personalities are similar. However, they are not as bad as Liam, because they are at least capable of taking things seriously. Even PB isn't as bad as Liam in this regard, and even her lines are not as terrible. Ultimately, I wouldn't say any of these characters belong in the Pathfinder team. If what I have said seems harsh, just think about what is being asked of these individuals. In the game, they are tasked with not only finding planets suitable for colonization by multiple species, but also with killing kett, and aiding another alien species, the Angara, in their 80-something year long war against the kett. They are also responsible for making first contact with other alien species, and making a good first impression. In all these operations, a lot of initiative, bravery, determination, cool-headedness, and self-reliance would be asked of the Pathfinder team, with little to no guidance or hand-holding from superiors, and no tight rulebook to follow. Keeping these in mind, are you convinced this group of individuals would be able to handle the stress and the danger? I am not convinced they would fare well. If we compare the Pathfinder crew to the 3 Normandy crews, the difference in magnitude is vast. The Normandy crews were composed of competent individuals, prepared for any conceivable danger, and they would be right at home in the Helios cluster. Just taking the three most boring companions from the Mass Effect trilogy, Jacob, Samara, and Vega, and comparing them to Liam is painful. Not only do Jacob, Samara, and Vega exude capability, seriousness, and competence, but their personalities are also congruent with their histories and roles. When Jacob says he served in the Alliance military for 10 years, the player believes him. When Samara says she is a Justicar and lives her life in accordance with a strict code, the player believes her. When Vega says he is an Alliance Marine and went on a mission where he collected information on the Collector base, the player believes him. When Liam says he was part of a civilian crisis response unit and is now a security and response specialist for the Initiative, the player wonders how he got those jobs. But while some of the crew members are a bit out of their depth, their captain is drowning in the deep. Listen to Ryder in these meetings.
Welcome aboard. Any thoughts, Ryder?
This isn't a military vessel, but there need to be rules. Better to ask about protocol. Let's talk about our success on Eos. Besides establishing our first viable outpost, we did some amazing things. We discovered the Remnant and breached their vault.
And didn't get killed.
Overcame radiation poisoning a number of times.
And didn't die.
Confronted by Kett at every turn.
Once again, did not get killed.
Let's focus. Back to the task at hand. Looking forward.
Exactly. Here's my only question. When do we hit that next vault? It looked active. We have to get on that.
Hang on. We need to not go off half-cocked.
There are initiative priorities. The team calls the shots.
Actually, the Pathfinder calls the shots, just to be clear.
So what do you need from us, Ryder?
Helios threw us for a loop. Meaning, we're kinda new at this. All of us. So let's figure out what the rules are now, and try to stick to them.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's head back to the Nexus. PB, Drac, see Lexi for a physical. Good meeting, everyone.
Do the translators not work?
They work.
I know we're improvising as we go, but let's remember that there is Pathfinder team protocol.
Don't think I got that handbook.
Ryder, we followed our best lead here, and now we don't even have that.
Jal has offered to do what he can to help us access the vault on Aya.
How do we do that when we're leaving the planet it's on?
That's a fair point. Jal?
Seriously?
Settle down. Ryder's right. There's an Angara right here. Let's hear from the new guy.
One day, about 80 years ago, the Archon and the Kett arrived in Helios, and the horror began.
They declared war?
Nothing so easy to define or fight.
The Kett kidnap Angara. Their people disappear without a trace. What if they were us?
Sure, I'll fight Kett all day long, but that's no plan.
We have a plan. Kind of. Pretty solid. Jal? Jal's told me about these two worlds. Havarl and Vol.
Pathfinder, it's your call.
Don't know yet. Just be ready to go at a moment's notice. Got it?
You bet.
Jal, give Callow the nav points for both planets. Let's do this.
Notice how I only picked the professional and logical options, ignoring the emotional and casual ones. The rest of the crew is terrible as well, but Pathfinder Ryder is the worst of the lot. It doesn't matter which of the 4, sometimes 2, options you pick in conversations. He never comes across as a leader, as a man of action, or as a superior officer. He comes across as limp-wristed, unconfident, and nice. Just nice. He is not someone you'd want to follow into battle. If one compares Ryder's dialogue with that of Shepard's, it's no contest. Shepard comes across as a leader, a man of action, and a superior officer every time. It is true that Shepard is sometimes a bit of a brick, but even at his brickiest, he still has an aura of confidence and authority. Amusingly as well, everything I have said about Shepard applies to Alec, except for the brick bit. Alec Ryder has that same aura of confidence and authority. I guess it comes from the N7 training, or the change in writing staff. The abrupt split between the personalities found in the Mass Effect trilogy and those found in Mass Effect Andromeda is expansive, and gave me this weird sense I was not playing a Mass Effect game. Where was the crew of competent specialists and squad members? Where was the military protagonist in this game? Yes, I know that Scott Ryder served in the Alliance military back in the Milky Way, but he doesn't act like someone who has served in the army, and he certainly doesn't act like someone who would be a good commander in the heat of battle. Honestly, he acts like the average young man you might meet at church, if church weren't cancelled. At this juncture, some may object, and say it isn't worth making a fuss about the split in personality types, which is found between the Mass Effect trilogy and Mass Effect Andromeda. Your Imperial Majesty, Mass Effect Andromeda has a different tone, a happier and lighter tone, so the characters need to accommodate to the general mood of the game. Sure, someone like Alec Ryder might have been a better Pathfinder and leader, but he would be far too serious and somber for the tone of Mass Effect Andromeda. This isn't a bad objection, but one of the game's other issues is its tone. For starters, it is another dramatic split from the original games. The Mass Effect trilogy had times for levity, romance and humour, of course, but the general tone of the first 3 games was a serious one. Seren, the Collectors, and the Reapers all posed serious threats, and were treated seriously. To have yet another split from the first 3 games makes the experience less Mass Effect in its feel. But worse than this perhaps, is the simple fact that Mass Effect Andromeda's story called for a more serious tone. Let's examine the antagonists of this story, the Kett. Not much is known about the Kett, other than they are like the Collectors from Mass Effect 2. Aliens who've been genetically modified to such an extent that they are no longer recognisable to the species from which they came. Now, what are the Kett doing in the Helios cluster? Well, their primary objective is to learn how to use remnant technology, or to be more accurate, this is the Archon's main goal. The secondary objective is to exalt the Angara, aka genetically alter the Angara and turn them into Kett. So for decades, the Kett have been waging a war against the Angara, killing many and genetically transforming the rest. By every account, the Kett are evil in their methods and ambitions, as well as probably vile in their origins. As antagonists in a story, they are badly written and awfully boring. But if you take a step back and imagine an alien species actually existing and doing these things, you wouldn't be able to help but take them and their actions seriously. Remember how I said the Kett are like the Collectors from Mass Effect 2? This is a bit of an understatement. They are a Collector's knockoff. The differences are threefold. First, the Kett serve themselves only. Second, the Kett turn other species into themselves for their own purposes, and third, the Kett are nowhere near as competent as the Collectors. But the parallels and similarities are there for all to see. Now, on the whole, Mass Effect 2 had a serious tone, and the game took the Collectors seriously, because they were a malevolent species. The Kett are just as malevolent as, and arguably more dangerous than the Collectors, because there are more of them. However, the game doesn't feel the need to burden itself with a heavy or serious tone, in spite of its villains. But this tonal mismatch is not just caused by the antagonists, it is caused by the situation in which our heroes find themselves. When the Hyperion arc arrives in Andromeda, the Ryder family discovers that the Golden Worlds, which were supposed to be vibrant, fertile planets, have been ruined by the energies emitted by the mysterious and dangerous Scourge. Moreover, things have gone horribly wrong on the Nexus, the space station which arrived a year before to set things up. The station isn't fully functional, many of the leadership died in their cryostasis pods, and there was a rebellion, which resulted in thousands of passengers being exiled, and the Krogan leaving to set up their own colony on one of the former Golden Worlds. The Nexus also tried to colonize a planet, but failed miserably. Also, did I mention a lot of people died? The only hope for fixing the habitability issues of these planets is activating the remnant vaults, which means using advanced technology that no one really understands. Yet, this is what Pathfinder Ryder must do in order to turn around a hopeless situation marked by consistent disappointment and failure. You wouldn't think the situation was so dire if you judged it purely by the reactions of the main characters. Ryder and his team are more than hopeful. They are not worried. They don't hold themselves seriously, aren't fazed by the fact they have to do the seemingly impossible, and don't act burdened, despite the fact more than 50,000 lives depend on them. If they were to act in a more serious manner, the tone would change, and the developers and writers clearly wanted the game to be a light-hearted ride. Ultimately, the story events called for a more serious tone, but the developers were set on making a light-hearted game, so they made a light-hearted game, and shrugged over whether the story fit or not. Before we move on, I feel compelled to point out that the cinematic trailers for Mass Effect Andromeda suggested the game would have a serious tone, more in line with the previous games. The light-hearted tone of the game was in no way communicated by these trailers. This split from the original trilogy results from two aspects of changed gameplay. First, the removal of the pause mechanic, and of the ability to order your squad mates to use their powers in combat. And second, the removal of the Paragon and Renegade dialogue options and roleplay options in character interactions. Let's talk about the combat changes first. I honestly liked the jetpacks. The removal of the class system barely registered with me, because I played the game as an infiltrator, and only swapped to the soldier profile occasionally. By the end of the game, I was using these three powers on repeat: Cloak, Singularity, and Energy Drain. For all intents and purposes, I had chosen to do an infiltrator class playthrough. What did register with me was the lack of control I had over my party members. In Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3, the player was able to pause the game and command his squad members to use their powers on specific enemies. In Andromeda, there is no pause ability, and while you can still command your squad members to target specific enemies, you cannot tell them to use their powers. If they have multiple target-based powers, they might use one, but it may not be the one you'd like them to use. What this means is that setting up biotic or tech combinations is difficult, and when it happens, it is either because you did the combination yourself, or you got lucky with your squad mate's AI. The AI for your squad mates isn't very good in this game, and they cannot tell when you are trying to set up a power combination. The inability to control your squad mate's powers may seem small, but it is actually a large gameplay split from the previous games, because the Mass Effect trilogy made squad-based combat a feature. Without the tactical control element, Andromeda feels like another nondescript sci-fi third-person shooter. In Mass Effect Andromeda, your squad mates are best used as bullet sponges and distractions while you do the real work. My go-to squad members were Drac and Vetra, because they were resilient and hard to kill. Let's move on to the dialogue and roleplay changes. The Paragon and Renegade dialogue system was a significant feature of Mass Effect. When engaged in conversation, the player had three response options: a Paragon option, for players who wanted Shepard to be a polite, noble, and charismatic leader, a Renegade option, for those who wanted Shepard to be a harsh, ruthless, and threatening leader, and a neutral option, which mediated between the two. Whichever Shepard you decided to play, Paragon or Renegade, Shepard was always an assertive and brave leader. Now, the Paragon and Renegade system had its problems, but it did allow the player an ability to roleplay. For instance, in Mass Effect 2, Shepard and crew travel to Omega to recruit Mordin Solus. Mordin has set up a clinic in a quarantined level of Omega where a virus is on the loose, killing everyone except the human beings and the Vulture who live there. Shepard and team encounter some human looters who are helping themselves to the items in a deserted flat. Shepard can either be a Paragon and persuade the looters to quit their criminal activities, or he can be a Renegade and threaten them into quitting. The result is the same, but the Shepard is different, and just as importantly, the player is allowed the option of using dialogue to influence the actions of NPCs, or, in some cases, to impose his will upon them.
You're working too hard.
But the Paragon and Renegade dialogue system was discarded in Mass Effect Andromeda, and replaced with a tonal system. you have 4, sometimes reduced to only 2, dialogue options: emotional, rational, casual, and professional. As much as was possible and reasonable, I opted for the rational and professional options. There are 2 big problems with the removal of the previous role-playing mechanisms and the implementation of this tonal system. 2 problems which result in a split between Mass Effect Andromeda and the previous Mass Effect games. The first is the player doesn't have the ability to use dialogue or role-playing mechanics to influence the actions of NPCs. When I went to the open world area of Kotoura, I noticed 2 individuals looting a corpse. Ryder can have a conversation with these 2 characters, so I initiated an exchange. Since I was trying to roleplay a professional and serious Ryder, I wanted to stop these disreputable cretins from looting corpses like this. However, I was unable to persuade or threaten the looters into going home and rethinking their lives, and they told Ryder to get lost. I wanted to shoot the rapscallions after this, but that wasn't an option. I, the player, was unable to roleplay and make these NPCs cease their looting. If this was Mass Effect 1, 2, or 3, the player would have been able to stop the NPCs either through charisma or terror. This isn't a single incident, by the way. This example represents the norm. Ryder is simply unable to influence NPCs to stop doing morally suspect actions. The second problem is that Ryder is straitjacketed into being a Boy Scout. Something I want to make clear here is that Ryder is not a paragon, despite superficial appearances. Shepard, if the player so chooses, is a paragon. Paragon Shepard, despite his professionalism, politeness, and principles, is an assertive and convicted man. Paragon Shepard rarely fails in getting his own way, still commands respect, and has an aura of confidence and charisma. Ryder has similar principles to Paragon Shepard, regardless of the player's dialogue options, but he lacks the charisma, professionalism, assertiveness, and confidence. Paragon Shepard acts like a man of action, who has principles and a code of honor. Ryder acts like a Boy Scout who has been told what his principles should be, and then been thrown into the big wide world bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. In the face of adversity or challenge, which cannot be solved using a big sniper rifle, Ryder is weak. He lets officials, such as Addison, disrespect and insult him without making any retort. The option to shut down Addison, either in a Paragon-esque or Renegade-esque manner, is sorely absent from the game. Ryder just takes it insipidly. Again, he acts like a Boy Scout who has just realised, contrary to anything he might have been told, that being polite and deferential doesn't always earn you the respect of peers. The removal of the Paragon Renegade system and its replacement with a tonal system of roleplay actually limits the realm and depth of roleplay which a player can enjoy. Mass Effect's prime identity was derived from the fact that it was a trilogy of role-playing games. The reduced capacity of the player to roleplay in Mass Effect Andromeda is therefore a massive split which only further divides the latest game from its predecessors. And this results in making the player's experience quite peculiar. This is something of a contradiction on the face of it. How could homages or nods to the Mass Effect trilogy, Mass Effect 1 in particular, help create a divide between the original games and Mass Effect Andromeda? Surely such things would help create a bridge between the games. In one way, they do, but in another, they do the opposite. Let's explore. The parallels with Mass Effect 1 are easy to detect. The Nexus is designed after the Citadel, the Remnant and the Jardin are like the Protheans. Ryder has to disobey direct orders from the Nexus leadership, similar to how Shepard had to disobey the Council, etc. The parallels with Mass Effect 2 and 3 are easy to detect as well. The Kett are like the Collectors. Their exaltation method is similar to how the Collectors turned members of the Milky Way species into mindless soldiers, etc. There is also a nod to the Citadel DLC right here. But by far the biggest parallels are found in the crew members. Peebee, Drac, and Vetra are rather obvious here. Peebee is an Asari maiden archaeologist who studies a dead ancient species which had advanced technology and has left many ruins. Basically, Peebee is Liara but unlikable. Liara was a young archaeologist who acted with a level of professionalism and had a generally agreeable personality. PB doesn't act like an archaeologist, actually scrap that. I guess she does act like an archaeologist, just not a good one. PB has attachment issues and generally doesn't seem to know what she is doing. She strikes one as a teenage rebel, looking for cheap thrills, not as an intrepid archaeologist. Tell me how Visasari managed to build a robot from remnant technology again? Drac is, well, a Krogan. He's a cross between Rex and Grunt. He has the experience, history, and wisdom of Rex, and a love for combat as strong as Grunt's. He is meant to be a throwback to what players of the trilogy loved about Rex and Grunt. The problem is, he isn't much more than that. Rex always had something of interest to say, and Grunt's loyalty mission and origin story not only developed his character, but also gave the player insight into Krogan society. Drac is fun to interact with, and is an immensely tough player companion, even on the insanity difficulty. But he isn't interesting or particularly engaging as a character. Vetra is a bit more interesting, but not by much. Some writer looked at the Mass Effect trilogy, noticed that a favourite character among fans was Garrus Vicarian, and said, the last popular Turian character was a male Citadel police officer who didn't play by the rules, so we should make a female Turian criminal character, well, criminal-ish, who doesn't play by the rules to make players like her. Oh, let's give her a loyalty mission where she has to save her little sister like Miranda, to make her more interesting as well. Like with Drac, it works. I found myself liking both Drac and Vetra, but as with Drac, there is nothing really interesting about Vetra other than her backstory. What's more, listening to Vetra talk about her sister constantly wears the player down, in a similar way it did with Miranda. Essentially, Vetra is Garrus without the attitude, coolness, and sniper rifle. She has double the eye visors to compensate. All these parallels / homages help to create the divide between the first 3 games and Mass Effect Andromeda. How? By simply drawing attention to the difference in quality between the games. Whenever you interact with PB, Drac, and Vetra, you are reminded of how good Liara, Rex, and Garrus were. Whenever you notice that the Nexus looks like the Citadel, you remember your first journey to the Citadel in Mass Effect 1. You remember the excellence of the first 3 titles, and when you look at the game you are currently playing and see it trying to harness this nostalgia in an attempt to make you like it, you notice the split in quality. It's true that these homages reminded me I was playing a Mass Effect game, but they also reminded me of how inferior this Mass Effect title was in comparison to its predecessors. One final thing I want to say on the homage factor. Despite the poor writing, construction and design of the game, and in spite of its many homages, Mass Effect Andromeda does not feel like professional fanfiction. I want to explain why Andromeda doesn't feel like fanfiction, and to do so, I must discuss 3 major attributes of fanfiction, professional and non-professional. Number 1, the story is set in the same world. Number 2, the canon characters are part of the story. Number 3, there are original characters, OCs, who are heavily inspired by the canon characters, CCs. Mass Effect Andromeda is set in another galaxy, and hundreds of years after the events of Mass Effect 3, so it barely counts as being set in the same world. The canon characters are not part of the story. There are audio recordings of Liara and Shepard, but they don't have any plot significance, and the Andromeda characters do not get to interact with them. Finally, there are no OCs in the fanfiction sense. Most of the characters are actually original. Liam, Cora, Callow, Suvi, Gil, Jarl, etc. don't have clear inspirational roots. For instance, the only similarity between Callow and Joker is they are both pilots. That is literally it. Callow is not a clone of Joker, posturing as an quote-unquote original character. He simply is original, although this is not to say that he is a good character. And Ryder is certainly not a clone of Shepard. Shepard and Ryder are completely different characters. Now, PB, Drac, and Vetra are definitely OC-like. Their inspirations are obvious, but because they are separated from the world where the CCs who inspired them reside, they are so detached that they don't feel or operate like OCs. To illustrate this last point, Imagine someone had written a high fantasy tale in the vein of The Lord of the Rings, which had a side character who was heavily inspired by the titular character of the Skullduggery Pleasant series, Skullduggery Pleasant. Sure, the character might not be quote-unquote original, but he wouldn't be an OC in the fanfiction sense, because he would be in a separate story and universe. Thus, the character would be closer to a Skullduggery Pleasant homage rather than an OC. This is similar to how PB, Drac, and Vetra act in Mass Effect Andromeda. Hence, the game doesn't feel like a work of professional fanfiction, but instead like a spiritual successor with imported intellectual property. Now, as mentioned before, one of these splits was essential. Mass Effect Andromeda had to break away from the Mass Effect story. As well, because of the endings, it was optimal in many ways for Mass Effect Andromeda to take place in another galaxy, so arguably, the second split was also justified. I want to make clear here that, in principle, I have no objection to spin-offs trying to define themselves and strut out on their own. I also have no principled objection to spin-offs or soft reboots attempting to split off from previous works in ways both big and small. However, Mass Effect Andromeda made too many splits, which divided itself from the franchise it was supposed to be a part of. I would argue that the first two splits, the story and world splits, were necessary to distinguish the game from its predecessors, and to allow the developers and writers to spread their wings in safety. These two splits successfully divided Andromeda from the trilogy and allowed it to create a separate identity. Or to be more accurate, these two splits would have allowed Mass Effect Andromeda to create a separate, but nevertheless still recognisable identity, if the writers and developers had done a good job with each one. But the writers and developers also decided to split from the original personality types, the original tone, and the original gameplay and roleplay features of the first 3 games, making Mass Effect Andromeda's identity as a Mass Effect game murky. Again, when I played it, I sometimes had to remind myself I was playing a Mass Effect game rather than a spiritual successor, giving an occasional nod to the Mass Effect trilogy. The splits and homage payments compounded each other to produce a game which shares enough elements with the first 3 games to be a Mass Effect release, but not enough for the game to actually feel like Mass Effect. The more hours I tanked into the game, the more I thought to myself, I suppose this is fun, but it doesn't feel like Mass Effect. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have an excellent day. Some of my regular viewers may be wondering why I didn't mention the progressive or woke elements in the game. Why weren't such things a target for my lampoons? To be short, apart from the obvious examples, such as female Krogan serving in combat roles, which they didn't do in previous games, an NPC suffering from gender dysphoria, whom I didn't encounter during my playthrough, and Cora's lesbian haircut, basically all the other progressive elements in Mass Effect Andromeda existed in the last 3 games. Women in combat, check. Homosexual relationships, check. Bisexual protagonist, check. Interspecies relationships, check. If sapient aliens came to Earth, you can bet your bottom pound sterling that progressives would advocate for sleeping with them. Fornication, check. These are just the most salient progressive things in the previous games. We could go deeper if we wanted. Now, some might argue that the Mass Effect trilogy is not woke, and I am inclined to agree, because it is not obnoxious and it's not exactly in your face. The Mass Effect games are, for the most part, well written, and this is why the trilogy's progressive values don't agitate people. To be honest, I find it strange that people even argued Mass Effect Andromeda was ruined by SJWs, because there is basically nothing progressive or woke in the game, which didn't exist in the previous titles.